There's a particular kind of man who believes he's above consequences. Not because he's smarter than everyone else, though he'll tell you he is, but because he spent decades watching consequences happen to other people. He fires 1,000 workers, and the stock ticks up 2 points. He guts a pension fund, and the board sends champagne. After enough years of that, he stops believing the bill will ever come. Garrett Soule was that kind of man. And Garrett Soule was wrong. Garrett ran a company called Conduit Dynamics. Now, if you've lived in any major city in the last 10 years, Conduit touched your life whether you knew it or not. After the supply chain collapsed in the early 30s, when half the world's freight infrastructure buckled and grocery stores went empty for weeks, logistics companies became the new power brokers. More important than banks, more powerful than most governments. And Conduit Dynamics was the biggest of them all. They controlled freight corridors, automated port systems, and urban distribution networks across 3 continents. Every package on your doorstep, every pallet of grain that reached a grocery warehouse, every shipping container that cleared customs at 4 in the morning, Conduit's fingerprints were on it. They didn't just move goods, they moved the world, and everybody knew it. And Garrett sat at the top of all of it, untouchable, unquestioned. The man who rebuilt the global supply chain after the collapse. At least, that's how the magazine covers told it. Time ran his face on their Person of the Year issue. He gave keynotes at Davos. World leaders took his calls on the first ring. When Garrett Soule spoke, freight moved. And when freight moves, everything moves. But Garrett had a secret. Several, actually. And he kept those secrets locked inside a system that recorded everything he ever did. Every transaction, every order, every signature. A system he trusted completely. Right up until the moment he tried to destroy it. What Garrett didn't understand, what men like him never understand, is that you can delete a file. You can wipe a server. You can burn the records and fire the people who kept them. But you cannot delete a consequence. The debt was already on the books. It was just waiting for someone patient enough to collect it. My name is the Karmic Debt Collector, and this is that collection. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where karma punches the clock. We tell stories about people who thought they were untouchable, and the moment the universe proved them wrong. If that sounds like your kind of thing, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and stick around. This one's going to take a minute, and trust me, it's worth every second. Now, to understand how Garrett Soule lost everything, you need to understand what he built. And more importantly, you need to understand the woman he threw away to protect it. Let's go back. 11 years back, in 2028, a 27-year-old systems developer named Maren Voss walked into Conduit Dynamics' downtown headquarters for her first day of work. She'd come up through State University, nothing fancy. Computer science degree, a thesis on distributed network architecture that her advisor called overbuilt, and 2 years of freelance consulting work that barely covered rent. She wasn't connected. She wasn't pedigreed. She was just good at what she did. Conduit hired her to help maintain their internal scheduling software, a clunky, off-the-shelf platform that crashed twice a week and couldn't sync across time zones. It was a mid-level job with mid-level pay and mid-level expectations. Maren didn't do mid-level. Within 6 months, she'd scrapped the old system and pitched something new to her department head. She called it Palisade. Not because the name meant anything grand, she just liked the sound of it. Said it sounded like something that would hold up under pressure. And hold up it did. Over the next decade, Maren turned Palisade from a simple scheduling tool into the nervous system of the entire company. It tracked executive communications. It logged board decisions. It archived every financial authorization with biometric stamps, meaning that every time Garrett Soule approved a transaction, his thumbprint and retinal scan were baked right into the record. Palisade wasn't hosted on some third-party cloud server either. Marin built it to run on Conduit's own distributed network. Server nodes spread across the company's facilities worldwide: Rotterdam, Singapore, Sao Paulo, Karachi. She designed it that way for speed and security. No outside vendor could access it. No government subpoena could pull records from a server farm in Virginia because the data didn't live in Virginia. It lived everywhere Conduit operated, fragmented and encrypted across dozens of nodes. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of engineering, and Garrett loved it. Not because he understood it, he didn't. He loved it because it made him fast. Palisade could surface any contract, any email chain, any financial record in seconds. It made Garrett look like the smartest man in every room. What Garrett never quite appreciated was the other thing Palisade made him: documented. Every decision, every shortcut, every signature on every questionable deal. All of it logged, time-stamped, and archived with his own biometrics. Marin knew this, of course. She built it. But she wasn't worried. She figured the CEO of a major corporation would want accurate records. That's what honest companies do. Garrett's soul did not run an honest company. For 6 years, Garrett and his CFO, a man named Roland Tanzer, had been running a fraud scheme so brazen it bordered on performance art. Here's how it worked. Conduit held billions of dollars in government and private contracts to build and maintain infrastructure: freight rail lines, automated ports, distribution hubs, the kind of critical systems that entire economies depend on. Garrett and Tanzer created a web of shell contractors, fake companies with real invoices, registered in jurisdictions where nobody asked questions and regulators had better things to do. On paper, these contractors were doing maintenance work, inspections, structural repairs, equipment upgrades. In reality, most of them barely existed. Some were nothing more than a registered name, a bank account, and a forwarding address. The invoices were inflated by anywhere from 40 to 70%, and the difference was funneled into offshore accounts controlled by Garrett, Tanzer, and a small circle of executives who knew better than to ask questions. It was systematic. It was practiced. They'd been doing it so long it felt routine. Just another line item on the quarterly reports. Over 6 years, they siphoned off north of $400 million. $400 million. But here's the thing about Garrett. He wasn't just greedy. He was greedy and cheap at the same time, which is a combination that gets people killed. See, to keep the profit margins looking right, to make sure nobody noticed the gap between what Conduit was billing and what Conduit was actually spending, Garrett cut corners on the projects they did complete. Substandard materials, reduced inspections, maintenance schedules stretched so thin they were practically decorative. Conduit's infrastructure, the backbone of global logistics across 3 continents, was rotting from the inside. And Garrett knew it. He'd seen the internal reports. Palisade had logged every one of them, filed neatly with his biometric approval stamps. Now, during this same period, a data journalist named Jun Yoon had been poking around Conduit's public filings for an independent outlet called The Burn Wire. June covered corporate crime, the kind of slow, grinding investigative work that most people don't have the patience for. She'd spent 2 years tracing Conduit's contractor payments, and she knew something was off. The numbers didn't add up. Shell companies kept appearing in filings and then dissolving 6 months later. But she couldn't prove it. Every trail dead-ended behind a wall of holding companies and NDAs. She had instinct and arithmetic, but she didn't have evidence. Not yet. The first domino fell on a Tuesday in March, in a freight hub outside Karachi. The facility was one of Conduit's flagship automated ports, or at least, that's what the press releases said. In reality, It was one of the projects Garrett had gutted to keep his margins clean. The structural supports used cheaper alloy composites. The automated loading arms hadn't been properly calibrated in over a year, and the inspection schedule had been cut from quarterly to annual, signed off by Garrett personally, 18 months earlier. 2 of the overhead loading systems collapsed during a shift change. The failure was catastrophic. 14 workers were injured, and 3 men, dock workers who'd been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, were killed. Conduit's PR team moved fast. Equipment malfunction, subcontractor negligence, an ongoing investigation. Our hearts go out to the families. The usual poison dressed up in a suit. Garrett's lawyers settled with the families quietly and quickly, the way you settle when you know the truth is worse than the price tag. But inside Palisade, the real story sat untouched. The original safety reports, the maintenance schedules with Garrett's biometric approvals, the internal communications where engineers had flagged structural concerns months before the collapse, and been told to file the reports and move on. And then, almost at the same time, a mid-level accountant in Conduit's Singapore office noticed something odd in the contractor billing. Nothing dramatic, just a number that didn't match a number it should have matched. He flagged it in an internal memo, sent it up the chain. That memo landed on Roland Tanzer's desk. Tanzer told Garrett, and Garrett, for the first time in years, felt something he hadn't felt since he was a young man, borrowing money he couldn't repay. He felt afraid, because now he had 2 problems. A paper trail connecting him to 3 dead workers, and a financial thread that could unravel $400 million in fraud. And both problems were sitting inside the same system, Palisade. Garrett didn't panic. That wasn't his style. He planned. He called a meeting with his executive security team and framed it as a modernization initiative. Conduit would be migrating to a new third-party operations platform. Palisade, the legacy system, was being decommissioned. All data would be transferred under strict security protocols. There was no migration. There was no new platform. Garrett hired 3 outside contractors, specialists in data destruction, brought in under ironclad NDAs. Their job was simple: a full wipe. Every archive, every communication log, every financial record that had ever passed through Palisade. 11 years of institutional memory, gone. But Garrett had a problem he needed to solve first. Maren Voss. She built Palisade. She knew it down to the code. If she was anywhere near the building when the migration started, she'd know within minutes that data was being destroyed, not transferred. She'd ask questions. She'd raise alarms. So Garrett got rid of her first. 1 week before the purge began, Maren was called into a conference room by HR. Her position, they told her, had been eliminated as part of a corporate restructuring. She was given a standard severance package and escorted out of the building within the hour. By the time she reached the parking garage, her access credentials had already been revoked. But Garrett wasn't done. Through intermediaries, whisper networks, back-channel calls to recruiters, quiet words at industry events, Garrett's people seeded a story. Maren Voss had been let go for cause. She was unreliable, difficult to work with. There were concerns about mishandled proprietary data. Nothing formal, nothing on paper. Just enough smoke to make every hiring manager in the industry think twice. Within 2 months, Maren couldn't get a recruiter to return her calls. Garrett didn't just fire the woman who built his empire. He salted the earth behind her, destroyed the system she'd spent a decade creating, then destroyed her ability to create anything else. It was efficient. It was thorough. And it was the single worst decision he ever made. 6 months later, Maren was living in a smaller apartment in a district she wouldn't have driven through 2 years ago. She'd applied to 14 positions, 14 rejections, some polite, most just silence. The blacklisting was doing its work. Garrett's people had been thorough. She wasn't broke yet, but she could see it from where she was standing. And she was angry. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a coal and doesn't go out. The Marin was, above all else, an engineer. And engineers don't sit with problems. They pick them apart. She started thinking about Palisade, not out of nostalgia, out of architecture. She knew the system had been purged, but she also knew something that Garrett's hired contractors didn't. Back in 2031, 3 years after she'd started building Palisade, a server failure at Conduit's Rotterdam facility nearly wiped out a week's worth of operations data. It was a close call, close enough that Marin lost sleep over it. So she built a failsafe, a redundancy protocol that automatically cached encrypted snapshots of critical data across multiple server nodes in Conduit's global network. If any primary database went down, the cached fragments could be used to reconstruct the lost records. The protocol was documented, buried in the technical specifications that Marin had filed with Conduit's IT department years ago. But nobody at Conduit read technical specifications. Nobody except Marin. She didn't know if the snapshots had survived the purge. If the contractors had been thorough, really thorough, they might have found and destroyed the cache nodes too. But Marin knew the kind of contractors companies like Conduit hired for jobs like this. They were good with primary databases. They followed the obvious architecture. They almost certainly didn't go hunting through distributed server nodes for a redundancy subsystem that wasn't even on the main schematic. Garrett had saved money on the demolition crew. And that's the kind of shortcut that comes back around. Now, I need to be clear about something, because this part matters. Marin didn't hack into Conduit Dynamics. She wasn't sitting in a dark room in a hood, running code on 3 monitors like something out of a bad movie. What she did was more like an architect walking back into a building through a service entrance that nobody remembered to lock. The redundancy system she'd built in 2031 ran on its own authentication layer, separate from Conduit's main network credentials. When Garrett's security team revoked Marin's access after she was fired, they killed her primary login, her email, her VPN access. Standard procedure. But they didn't touch the cache system's credentials because they didn't know the cache system existed. It was like changing every lock in the house but forgetting about the cellar door, because you never knew there was a cellar. Over 3 months, working from her apartment on a secondhand laptop, Marin pulled fragments from server nodes scattered across the globe. It was brutal, tedious work. The cached snapshots were partial and encrypted. Each one was a puzzle piece, and she had to figure out which pieces fit together and which were just noise. Some of it was junk. Routine scheduling data, calendar entries, system logs that meant nothing. But buried in the fragments, scattered across servers in Rotterdam and Singapore and Sao Paulo, she started finding the real material. Financial authorization records with Garrett's biometric stamps. Internal communications between Garrett and Tanzer, discussing shell contractor payments in language so casual it made your stomach turn. Budget memos where they actually joked, about how much they were skimming. And then, sitting on a cache node in Conduit's Karachi facility, the same facility where 3 workers had died, she found the original safety reports. Not the sanitized versions that had been submitted to investigators. The originals. The ones that showed exactly what the engineers had warned, exactly what Garrett had been told, and exactly what he'd chosen to ignore. 3 months of work. And Marin had what no regulator, no journalist, no competitor had ever gotten close to. A complete, authenticated picture of who Garrett's soul really was. Every lie, every theft, every cut corner, all of it stamped with his own thumbprint. Now, a less careful person would have taken that data and blasted it across every news outlet on the planet, done a massive dump, let the chips fall, and hoped for the best. Marin didn't do that. Because Marin understood something about the world that most people learn the hard way. Information without strategy is just noise. She knew that if she went to law enforcement directly, Conduit's legal army would bury the case in motions and countersuits before anyone looked at the evidence. They'd come after her for unauthorized access, flip the narrative, make her the story instead of Garrett. And a massive public data dump? She'd seen how those played out. 3 days of headlines, then information fatigue sets in. The public moves on. Garrett's PR team reframes everything. The story dies. So Marin used the tools she knew best. Palisade's analytical frameworks. The same scheduling and logistics optimization tools she'd built for Conduit to plan a strategic disclosure campaign. Not a flood, a sequence. Each piece of evidence timed to land at the exact moment it would cause maximum damage. Spaced so that Garrett could never get ahead of the story before the next piece dropped. And she reached out to one person, June Yoon, at the burn wire. Marin didn't hand June everything. She gave her just enough to verify. A few authenticated documents with internal Conduit watermarks and metadata that only someone with deep system access could have produced. June, who'd been chasing Conduit's shadow for 2 years, recognized immediately what she was looking at. They struck a deal. June would get exclusive reporting rights on each stage of the disclosure, but only if she published on Marin's timeline. No jumping ahead, no improvising. June agreed without hesitation. She was a journalist. She knew the difference between a bonfire and a slow burn, and she knew which one left a mark. Week 1. June published a detailed report on irregularities in Conduit's contractor billing. The shell company scheme, laid out in painstaking detail, backed by internal documents with authentication markers that couldn't be faked. It was dense, technical, not the kind of thing that trends on social media, but it was airtight. The financial press picked it up. Conduit stock dropped 4% in a day. Garrett's response was right out of the playbook. The documents are fabricated. This is the work of a disgruntled former employee. Conduit's legal team is investigating the breach. He'd done this dance before. He was good at it. Week 3. June dropped the second piece. Internal communications between Garrett and Tanzer. Not summaries, not allegations. They're actual messages. Specific dollar amounts. Account routing numbers. Garrett's own words, time-stamped, authenticated with biometric data. The financial regulators in 3 countries opened preliminary inquiries. Conduit's board of directors called an emergency session. Garrett told them, with a straight face, that it was under control. Week 5. The third release. And this one changed everything. The third release wasn't about money. June published the original Karachi safety reports, the real ones, side by side with the doctored versions that Conduit had submitted to investigators after the collapse. The differences were damning. Structural warnings that had been removed, maintenance failures that had been rewritten as routine inspections, risk assessments that had been changed from critical to acceptable. And at the center of it all, one internal message. From Roland Tanzer to Garrett Soule, sent 6 months before 3 men died in that freight hub. Tanzer had flagged the structural risks, said the Karachi facility needed an emergency maintenance overhaul. And Garrett, this was his actual response, pulled directly from Palisade's archives with his biometric confirmation attached. Garrett wrote back 4 words and a sentence. We're not spending money fixing a warehouse in Karachi. Patch it and move on. Patch it and move on. 12 words. That was the value Garrett Soule assigned to 3 human lives. Not a meeting, not a discussion, not even a full paragraph of consideration. Just an impatient directive fired off between a board call and a lunch reservation. And 6 months later, the ceiling came down on 14 workers, and 3 of them went home in bags. Their names, by the way, weren't in Garrett's message. They were never in any of his messages. To Garrett, they weren't people. They were overhead. Line items in a facility he'd probably never visited and couldn't find on a map without help. But they had names. They had families. One of them had a daughter who'd just started school. Another was 3 months from retirement, 30 years on the docks, and he didn't make it to the finish line. The third was 22 years old, first real job. His mother had thrown a dinner to celebrate when he got hired. Up to this point, this had been a fraud story. White-collar crime. The kind of thing that ends in fines and maybe a book deal. That's what the public thought. That's what June thought. That's even, to some extent, what Marin thought when she'd started pulling the data. But this was different. This wasn't accounting fraud. This was negligent homicide. 3 people dead because a man who stole $400 million couldn't be bothered to spend a fraction of it keeping a building standing. The public response was volcanic. Conduit stock didn't just dip, it cratered. Trading was halted twice in one day. The families of the Karachi workers, who had quietly accepted settlements months earlier, filed a joint civil suit, this time armed with evidence that hadn't existed when they'd first signed those papers. Regulatory bodies in 4 countries opened formal criminal investigations. Conduit's board, which had been content to ride out a financial scandal, started hiring personal attorneys. And Garrett Soule, the man who rebuilt the supply chain, the visionary, the titan, watched his name become something people spat. $400 million stolen. And Garrett might have survived it. Rich men survive fraud all the time. They pay fines, they write checks, they sit in minimum security for 18 months and come out with a podcast deal. But 3 workers dead because he wouldn't spend the money to keep a building from falling? That's a different kind of debt. That's the kind you don't negotiate down. Inside Conduit's headquarters, Garrett was coming apart. He didn't know where the leaks were coming from. His security team traced the published documents back to Palisade's data architecture, but that was impossible. Palisade had been purged. He'd stood in the server room and watched the contractors run the wipe protocols. The system was dead. Wasn't it? He interrogated the contractors. They swore the job was thorough. Every primary database, every backup, every archive, wiped clean. Garrett didn't believe them, but he couldn't prove them wrong either. So he turned on his own people. He fired his head of corporate security on a Monday. A woman who'd been with the company for 9 years, walked out with a box of personal items and a non-disclosure agreement still wet with ink. By Wednesday, he'd accused 2 board members of leaking documents to the burn wire. Neither had any connection to June Yoon. One of them had never even heard of the burn wire. But Garrett didn't care about evidence anymore. He cared about control. And control was slipping through his fingers like water through a cracked pipe. Then he went after Tanzer, his oldest ally, his partner in every crooked deal for over a decade. The man who knew where every body was buried because he'd helped dig half the holes. Garrett called him into his corner office, closed the door, drew the privacy glass, and demanded to know if he was the source. Tanzer sat there across the desk from the man he'd spent 15 years following and saw something new in his eyes. Not anger. Tanzer had seen Garrett angry plenty of times. This was different. This was a man who had stopped calculating outcomes and started reacting on instinct. A drowning man grabbing at anything within reach, not caring if he pulled someone else under. So Tanzer did the only rational thing a man in his position could do. He went home that night, poured himself a drink he didn't finish, and called a defense attorney. By the end of the week, He was in a room with federal regulators, answering questions and naming names. Here's the thing about a man who trusts no one. Eventually, he's right. Everyone around him does become a threat, but only because he made them that way. Every executive Garrett fired became a potential witness. Every ally he threatened was one more person with nothing left to lose and plenty to gain from cooperation. Garrett spent weeks tearing apart his own inner circle, hunting for the traitor who was feeding his secrets to the press. He never found one. Because the person doing it was sitting in a one-bedroom apartment across town, working on a second-hand laptop, drinking cold coffee at 2 a.m. Garrett's security team eventually traced the leak, not to a person inside the company, but to something much worse. The data was coming from inside Conduit's own server network. The distributed cache fragments that Marin had accessed, the redundancy system she'd built in 2031, were still active, still sitting on Conduit's own infrastructure, still recording, still caching snapshots of critical data the way they'd been designed to do. The purge had killed Palisade's primary databases, but the cache layer was a different system, running on a different protocol, embedded so deep in Conduit's operational architecture that the contractors hadn't even known to look for it. And Marin hadn't just pulled old data and disconnected. She'd maintained a persistent, read-only connection through the maintenance access layer she'd built years ago. A connection that was still active, still pulling. Which meant Marin hadn't just recovered evidence of the original fraud. She'd been watching Garrett's cover-up in real time. Every panicked email to his lawyers. Every file he'd tried to destroy after the Burnwire started publishing. Every coerced statement. Every threatened executive. Every desperate attempt to contain the damage. She had all of it. The cover-up evidence was worse than the original crime. And here was the final turn of the knife. Garrett's people told him they could shut it down, kill the cache layer, sever the connection, lock Marin out for good. But to do it, they'd have to take Conduit's entire operational network offline. The cache system was woven into the same distributed infrastructure that managed the company's logistics, communications, and port management across 3 continents. You couldn't kill one without killing the other. Shutting it down would halt freight operations worldwide. It would strand cargo ships, freeze automated ports, and crash supply chains that thousands of businesses depended on. The cost would be measured in billions, and it would effectively end Conduit as a functioning company. Garrett's soul was trapped inside his own machine. The system he'd relied on for 11 years. The system he'd tried to destroy. It was still running, and it was still recording every move he made. Garrett built his empire on infrastructure, pipelines, networks, systems. He never understood that infrastructure doesn't care who owns it. It just carries whatever is put through it. For 11 years, it carried his orders. Now it carried his confession. The end came fast. 2 weeks, start to finish. Like a building that takes years to weaken and seconds to fall. Tanzer flipped completely, sat down with federal investigators in a windowless room and gave them everything. Names, account numbers, routing protocols, the internal mechanics of 6 years of fraud laid out like an instruction manual. He brought documents. He brought recordings. He brought the kind of cooperation that only comes from a man who's realized that loyalty to Garrett's soul is a one-way street that ends at a cliff. In exchange, he got a cooperation agreement and a reduced sentencing recommendation. It was more than he deserved and less than Garrett could survive. 3 board members resigned within 48 hours of each other. Not together, each one separately, each one with their own lawyer, each one trying to put as much daylight between themselves and Garrett's soul as humanly possible. Conduit's largest institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, the kind of money that doesn't spook easily. pulled their holdings. The stock, already in freefall, was formally suspended from trading pending regulatory action. The indictment came down on a Thursday morning. Gray sky, quiet courthouse. 47 counts. Fraud, embezzlement, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and 3 counts of criminally negligent homicide. 1 for each worker who died in Karachi. Garrett's assets were frozen. Every account, every property, every offshore holding that Tanzer had helped the investigators find. His legal team, the best attorneys money could buy, withdrew from representation when the retainer accounts were seized. Turns out even high-priced lawyers have a price, and that price is getting paid. His wife filed for separation the same week. His adult son, who held a seat on one of Conduit's subsidiary boards, released a 3-sentence public statement distancing himself from his father. 3 sentences. That's all it took to cut the thread between father and son. June Yoon published her final piece for the Burn Wire, a long-form feature that laid the entire story bare, from the first stolen dollar to the last desperate cover-up. It became the most read article in the outlet's history. It named Maren Voss, with Maren's permission, as the engineer who'd recovered the evidence. Maren approved the story on her own terms. She still didn't do interviews. 47 counts. That's the number the prosecutors settled on. But the real count was 3. 3 dock workers in Karachi who showed up for a shift one morning and never came home. One had a daughter who'd just started school. Another was 3 months from retirement. The third was 22 years old, working his first real job. Every other number in this story, the millions stolen, the stock price, the indictments, every single one traces back to those 3 men. That's where the debt started. That's where it ends. So, what happened to everyone? Maren Voss was investigated for unauthorized access to Conduit's network. The inquiry lasted 3 months and went nowhere. Her legal team argued, correctly, that she'd accessed a system she personally designed, using maintenance credentials that Conduit's own security team had failed to revoke. Was it a gray area? Sure. But the political reality was simpler than the legal one. No prosecutor in the country wanted to be the person who charged the whistleblower who'd exposed a corporate killer. Not with the Karachi families on every front page. Not with that kind of public sentiment. Maren was offered positions at 3 different companies within weeks of the story going public. She took one, a smaller firm, nothing flashy, nothing that would make headlines. She started building something new. Kept her head down. Didn't do interviews, didn't write a memoir, didn't launch a podcast. A reporter once asked her how it felt to take down one of the most powerful men in the industry. She said she hadn't taken down anyone. She'd just recovered some files. That was the only quote she ever gave. June Yoon won a major investigative journalism award for the Conduit series. She used the platform to push for stronger corporate transparency legislation, not the watered-down kind that lobbyists draft in hotel conference rooms, but the kind with teeth. Whether it passes is another story for another day. But June's still fighting for it, and she's not the kind of person who stops. Roland Tanzer, cooperating witness, reduced sentence. He'll spend 4 years in a minimum security facility, which is 4 years more than he expected, and about 4 years less than he deserves. He'll probably write a book. They always do. That math never quite balances out, but the system works the way it works. And Garrett's soul. denied bail. Flight risk, the judge said, and nobody in the courtroom argued the point. His preliminary hearing was attended by the families of the 3 Karachi workers, who sat in the front row and said nothing. They didn't need to. Garrett Soule spent 11 years building a machine that recorded everything. Every decision, every signature, every shortcut, every lie. And when the bill came due, he tried to erase it all. Tried to wipe the evidence. Tried to destroy the woman who'd built it. Tried to burn the memory of what he'd done so thoroughly that even the ashes wouldn't talk. But here's what men like Garrett never understand. And it's the same thing, every time. You can delete a file, but you can't delete a consequence. You can fire the architect, but you can't unbuild the building. You can shred the receipt, but the purchase was still made. And you can wipe a server until the drives are clean enough to eat off of. But you cannot wipe the fact that 3 men died on a floor you knew was going to break. The debt was always there. It was written into the infrastructure, coded into the records, stamped with his own fingerprints, buried in server nodes across 3 continents, waiting patiently in the dark. It was just waiting for someone with the skill, the patience, and the quiet, burning determination to dig it up, piece it together, and slide the bill across the table. And that is where I come in. That's the story. And if you made it this far, all the way through, I appreciate you. Taking the time to sit with it, to let it breathe, to hear the whole thing out, that matters to me. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome to the collection. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. I've got more stories like this one. Stories about people who thought they were above the bill, and the exact moment the universe proved them wrong. Every week, another debt gets collected. If you're already part of the family, drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think Garrett's biggest mistake was? Was it the fraud itself? Was it the cover-up? Or was it underestimating the quiet engineer who knew his system better than he ever did? I want to hear your take. The best conversations on this channel happen down in the comments, and I read every single one. Like the video if you think it earned it. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that karma doesn't forget, it just takes its time. Until next time. The debts are piling up, and I'll be back to collect.